Heralds emerged on the balcony overlooking the city square. They raised their golden trumpets to blare a short melody, then retreated to make way for a burly man draped with fur and golden regalia. He raised his hands to command the attention of the people who were gathered below. Taumei, good people of Eudora, I, your good lord, Baron Harmond, cousin to Her Majesty Queen Osmara, am honored to announce that Her Majesty has been blessed with a third child. A jubilant roar trembled the walls. Hats flew, and children riding on their parents' shoulders waved coats and kerchiefs. The Baron took this moment to turn back toward the large crystal ball propped on the tail feathers of a peacock pedestal. Do you hear that, Osmara? Harmond asked smilingly at the crystal. The crystal was a bubble of smoky clouds and glittering seams, sealed still and polished glossy. Reflections slid across the globe whenever people passed. Their visages were warped and deformed by the curvature, pulled tight and narrow at the poles, but bloated across the equator. Most of the reflections' details were too muted to discern, cast only as dark, featureless figures sailing over the surface. The reflection of the Baron's toothy grin, however, shocked in contrast. Excluding the deformed perspective, the reflections in the crystal seemed accurate. The courtiers and knaves who navigated past the Baron were perfectly mirrored in pace and manner. There was, however, one phantom in the orb with no counterpart on the balcony. Her features were shaded with no more definition than any of the others in the crystal's vicinity, but her supposed seat at the Baron's side was vacant. From where the Baron's hand rested, the reflection suggested that he should be able to feel the velvet drape of her gown. That the Baron could feel the fibers demonstrated the power of that suggestion. To serve as a channel of communication, the Baron had to relinquish his authority to interrupt the sum of his senses. The crystal would be a conduit for what he should feel, and engaging it necessitated abdicating any presumption of intimacy. Comments, conclusions, moods, and ideas strolled through him, the plain and uneventful sort that any consciousness could stumble across. Where such ramblings could normally be ignored, however, Harmond had to endure. He could feel the polished wood of the armchair, but he accepted the velvet lay there, and so his fingers tingled. He could smell the dry desert air blowing over the city walls, but preferred the incense that the crystal insisted was being burned nearby. The desert heat, which had caused sweat to stain the brim of his feathered cap, chilled as his body shifted from a summer swelter to winter shivers. The people's jovial roar resounded in an illusory distance, confirming that Osmara could hear the cheers of the people from her window. Are you that close? Harmond started searching the skies for the floating castle where the queen had taken residence. But more epiphanies rambled through him. As Harmond listened, his giddy smile faded into a nervous sneer. A stroke of luck let him catch that his last thought was really his, and he quickly averted his gaze from the crystal to keep from making an unanticipated admission. The fat head of the Baron again peeked over the balcony to the celebrating crowds. He flicked his hands at the heralds, who played a short, assertive melody. The crowd's jubilance quieted, and the Baron continued. All hail His Highness, Prince Lunarier of Hexen, 3rd Prince of Escambreco. A few cheers were scattered amidst the audience, but they had begun as a matter of habit rather than appreciation, and lacked the stamina to survive comprehension. The news was unwelcome. Could the crowd resent the few claps given? Harmond rejected their response. He signaled the trumpets again, which commanded more enthusiasm from the square. Hail, Prince Lunarier of Hexen, 3rd Prince in the 8th generation. Long live the prince! Harmond waited while the crowd fumbled through their cheer, then continued. Let the night be made ready for celebration, for today is a holiday. Take yourselves away from your labors. Tonight there shall be drinking and dancing in the streets of Eudora. His publicly shared, hopeful grin twisted to a snarl as he turned from the vantage to bark orders at his butler. Open the storeroom. Prepare the large festival kegs. Ready fireworks. Servants scattered in every direction at the commands, leaving Harmond alone to temper himself before returning to the crystal. Osmara, a son? He should see for himself. The prince is beautiful. Or was he? The Baron felt sympathetically charmed by the baby, but had as of yet not been able to distinguish its silhouette. Harmon danced around the crystal stand, perusing for the perfect light to highlight the forms. Osmara held the baby up, flooding the crystal surface with the warped face of her newborn son. To Harmon, the face was indistinguishable from any other infant. Osmara, do you think it wise to be so bold with the fact that you've had a son, your third at that? He should not have said that. Osmara's temper ignited his guilt. How could he speak so impertinently? Billowing despair choked his hope. There was no shame in Lunario's sex. He begged for an end to the branding anxiety before it convinced him to throw himself over the balcony. The prince was still one of her children, and was destined to someday be brother to the future queen. He would be counsel to her, would know her. Mark her words, Harmon. Clutching the child, Osmara stood and stormed off until her reflection had grown so narrow and swooping that it was lost beyond the globe's horizon. Harmon fell to his knees, wheezing and weeping through feelings that were not his. He was, as he again considered the situation, quite right. These remnant molestations to his reason were wanting to be washed from his senses with ego and self-interest. When he was at last cleansed, he rose to his feet and waved a command that the crystal be taken away. A new face suddenly flooded the crystal, and with it Harmon was washed with another wave of guilt. The Baron signaled to stall the servant, whom had only just clasped the base. She relinquished and retreated. "What, mother?" Harmon snapped. "The whole city will be in an uproar. How am I supposed to deal with a mob of humans upset because she cannot have a daughter? Do you want me to keep the city of Eudora in Hexen hands?" Those people were his concern. He was there to act as the hand of the queen. She is riddled with enough guilt as it is, and does not need him to make it worse for her. His emotional foundation, the font of appreciation that had been lavished on him since birth, could easily be swayed to skin him herself if he dared to hold Osmara accountable for this child. The last thought agitated Harmon enough to wrestle off the crystal's oppression. "A classic display of motherhood," Harmon snapped at the nervous nobles and servants drifting in and out of the hall. "You know I love to hear you nag and whine and scathe like nails on slate." He waved off the crystal again, and the servant girl made quick work of carrying it away. Harmon stomped up the dais, squatted in front of his throne, then collapsed into the cushions. His great bulk sank into every crevice and wrenched a grumble from the wood. "Honestly," Harmon massaged an ache in his brow, "these people are not going to hold still for another century to see if the queen is barren. Even I'm growing impatient." His muttering earned no response from the courtiers. "By Orkhan's pity, double up patrols tonight," Harmon shouted. A scribe slunk forward with a parchment and a freshly inked quill. Harmon continued, "No guard is free tonight. Give them double pay to be twice as hard on criminals, and dock the rations of any with a smart lip." Harmon pressed a goblet against his lips, but he did not drink immediately, only whispered across its brim, "I have had more than enough wit for one day." "I do not want to." The toddler's wail pierced ears. Their gazes were set defiantly against one another, but still the child felt compelled to weave herself between the legs of the untreated wooden stool on the side of the table furthest from her mother. "Come now, Nessa, it is time for bed," her exhausted mother posed, ready to pounce. "No," came Vanessa's stout reprimand. The child's defiance shattered the facade of endless patience, and her mother bounded around the table. The spindle-thin legs of the chair, which once provided so much protection against her mother's advance, now caged Vanessa in. Her desperate scamper under the table was not quick enough to escape her mother's lightning-fast grab. Fingers, bruised from infant bites, scalded by the boiling froth of untended pots, and withered from soaking in the tubs of suds and dishes, had an invincibly tight hold on the pale, nimble ankle. No matter how she wrestled, Vanessa could not free her foot. As she began to slide out from underneath, her hands flailed about, eventually catching the legs of the table. The squeal of the legs as they skid across the floor almost matched Vanessa's shrill wails. "If you are good and go to bed, I will have grandmother tell you a story when she comes back home," the mother pleaded. "No." The heel of her boot and her spare hand were strategically anchored against the table, and with a steady pull she fought to pry her daughter's hands off of the legs. The clank of a lifting lock and squeal of iron hinges drew the girl's attention to the door. The interruption had not distracted her mother, however, and a sudden yank pulled the girl out from below the table. Vanessa screamed as though she had fallen to her death. Thrown over the shoulder, her mother stood up, erasing the floor from beneath Vanessa's stockinged feet. The mother could not wrestle her daughter into submission, however, especially after Vanessa had seen whom had walked through the door. A tantrum kick landed sharply in her mother's breast. Exhausted, the mother's hand slipped from her child, who squirmed and fell to the floor, only to pick herself up and run shrieking to the sanctuary of her grandmother's ankles. "She wants to put me to bed, Grandmom!" "Oh, my poor Nessa," the elder said, kneeling just beyond the lintel to embrace the child. "You do not want to go to bed. How about if I tell you a story instead?" she said, casting a devious smirk at her son's wife. An overwhelming joy played like fire across Vanessa's face, and the girl silently busied herself for bed. With downcast eyes, the mother silently sighed. "Thank you." "Has she been that much trouble, Marie?" the grandmother asked quietly as she approached. "Thankfully not. We were actually having a very good time until I tried to put her to bed." A handsome hand slithered itself around Marie's nimble waist, and a gentle kiss was planted onto her cheek. "Hello, Hector," Marie chimed at her passing husband. "Did you have a good time?" The grandmother huffed, and her bosom bounced with discontent. The last to pass under the lintel, a bony man with gray speckles in the soot-black of his mustache and mop of hair, answered first. "It could have been worse." "This celebration certainly has set a new standard, though," Hector snarled. Marie turned a furrowed, curious glance toward her husband. "Best not to have asked, dear," the grandmother singingly whispered as she passed. Hector went on. "Some madman was raving about the end of the dynasty. He made a complete spectacle of himself." Marie was confounded. "What happened?" Calmly, the elderly, mustached man slunk into the chair under which Vanessa had earlier tried to hide, and explained. He was drunk, going from table to stir up trouble and doubt. I cannot say that I blame him, or those who would look to him for some answer. This prince is a bad omen. "Fairy speak," Hector accused. "Whomever would follow that man is just as blind as he is. He dared denounce us as ignorant and lame, ranting about us being slaves to the witches. Our contentment and apathy is a measure of their success," Hector mocked. "But did he have any answers?" "No, he said so himself." "He got Hector all worked up," the elderly man interjected. "I asked him what we should do about it. After all, if he thinks we are so stupid, then he must have some answer. Do you know what he said? He will not save us, that he will not be the crutch to substitute for the witches. As if I need a witch." "What have I not achieved by my own will?" Hector scoffed and turned to face the lit hearth. There was something comforting to him in watching the flames as they ate the blackened logs. Their flicker matched the fury that flickered in his eyes, a fury fueled by his revulsion. Disgusting were the words that man spoke. Disgusting were those of whom he spoke. Still, Hector could not wrestle the accusation out of his mind. The notion that he might be too ignorant to realize his ignorance left him chilled beyond even the fire's warmth. Then his worry drifted to those hidden in his shadow, cast by the fire's light across the whole of the room behind him. Swirling paisley was made ever more dizzying as Vanessa curled herself inside the patterned blanket. Her wide eyes, once stained with disappointed tears, now gleamed with hope, and she beamed a smile bright enough to penetrate the thick shadow cast from her father's feet. The chain strung across her grandmother's bodice jingled as the matriarch approached, setting a pudgy hand on the daughter's blanketed knee. "What story would you like to hear, my sweet?" "A Drabolton kiss." The grandmother smiled, took a deep breath, and began. She did not know that he was waiting for her, but he would wait until she did. Moment after moment he watched to see if she would see, but she would not look because she did not know she was supposed to. "Stop it," Hector screamed at his mother. but attracting everyone's attention. They searched in the shadows for his face, but they could only discern his silhouette against the burning hearth. Do not dare tell her that story. I never want you to tell her that story again. Hector, his mother's voice blistered with reprimand. It's just a story. It is her favorite story. And she is my daughter. His breath was heavy, and he slowly turned his head to see his family cast their bewildered stares at him. I do not want her head filled with false hope. Papa, I like that story, Vanessa squeaked. Hector fell to his knees beside her bed and grasped her tiny hands in his. Vanessa, my darling, you are a worthy person. You do have something to offer this world. Do not resign yourself to waiting for some charm or trinket put in your hand by a witch. It will not make you a better person. There is nothing waiting for you. Do you understand that? Vanessa's smile died as she stared into her father's worry-soaked eyes. Hector, what are you talking about? Marie inquired. It is just a story. The elderly mustached man gently took Marie's arm. No, Marie. I think Hector might be right. Thank you, Father. I am scared, Hector's father continued. Scared because there is nothing in this world that I would credit to humanity. Everything I have ever had was set at my feet by the witches, and I was content with that. Worst of all, I think I wasted my life waiting for something. Let us end that here. Chateau, it is a story, the grandmother rebutted. And a powerful one at that, Esther, Chateau replied. Grandmom, I want my story, Vanessa begged, dragging on Esther's apron. But she could not be roused. Esther stared blankly at her husband for a long while, disturbed by his newfound conviction and its implication on their life together. Grandmom? Esther noticed Vanessa. No, dear, perhaps not tonight. I will sing you a lullaby instead. Heartbroken, Esther turned from her family and seated herself on the foot of the bed, cooing Vanessa with somber lyrics over a carousel melody. The child was quick to turn away. She nestled herself, half curled under the paisley blanket. Her grandmother's song was ignored, and she sought her own solace in the cool puddle formed in her pillow by her disappointed tears.